Before we look at the crisis phase, which is stage 3, let's take a moment to examine what you wrote in your blog. If you're like most people, the things that you entered there were a little bit more difficult to type in than what you wrote for stage 1. And the reason for that is that you probably were having to identify behaviors that weren't terribly socially appropriate or something you could be very proud of. And in many cases, they're things that, while maybe functional for allowing you to ventilate stress, they aren't very socially functional. They're the sorts of things that later on you need to go back and make amends for or apologize for. Now, in many cases, you may have some that are fairly well adapted. For example, some of you are going to be the kind of person that grows very quiet or withdraws when you're agitated. Others of you might do things that are nonverbal behaviors that others pick up on very easily, like slamming cupboard doors or stomping off or walking really quickly or crossing your arms fiercely across your chest while glaring at somebody. Now, these behaviors, as I said, aren't necessarily socially appropriate, but they're also not nearly as socially damaging as some of the behaviors that we might observe in our clients and patients. So these behaviors can include, in the population of people we'd be supporting, things like gestures that are threatening or words that are threatening, even acts of aggression, especially towards objects. And typically these would be sort of spontaneous acts of aggression as opposed to targeted aggression or plotted aggression. The person might swear more often or swear and say things that they normally don't say. They might become very, very loud. And again, we're going to notice a real rapid change. I should also note that all the things that you were doing in stage 1 are continuing or even increasing. They don't go away. As we go up our arousal, we're adding new behaviors and accelerating or intensifying the ones that were there beforehand. So now we come to stage 3, and even though we've said there are 5 stages, remember that stage 3 is the highest stage. And that's a very important distinction for me when I work with groups to develop crisis intervention plans. I always ask them, when we're looking at behaviors for stage 3, has anybody ever seen this individual go further than this behavior? Because if we have, that means that the behavior isn't in stage 3. Stage 3 is defined as the behaviors at the peak of the individual's arousal and at the nadir of their cognitive ability. They are the most unlike themselves in this particular phase, and that's what gives it this name of crisis. So in this state, the person is now experiencing extreme anxiety. They have a complete loss of rationality and will be very different than the way that most people already know them. Not all people are dangerous in this stage. A while back, we looked at the arousal cycle of 3 different people, and one of them, while it looked at first blush like it was a very challenging arousal cycle, on closer examination revealed that the person never really got very aggressive or angry at all. So just because a person sometimes maybe finds themselves in stage 3 fairly often doesn't mean that they are necessarily posing a harm to others. Some people, for example, withdraw and are not dangerous to anybody at all. In fact, in many cases, that's the most functional thing for that individual to do. They withdraw, get themselves back on track, and re-enter the social milieu. It's very difficult to sustain the crisis phase, and in the pre-question or the pre-assessment, you're asked whether or not it's true or false that people who are addicted to a substance, who are involved with a substance, are more likely to have an extended crisis phase. While there may be a mild extension, the answer is generally false. People, even in their drug-induced state, are more volatile, they're more sensitive to stressors, and so they're easy to re-escalate, but typically every person wants to calm down and restabilize while they are in this phase. Now, there's a difference between being stimulated, such as the effects of a drug, and being in extreme arousal or anxiety, and they're not entirely the same thing. So, for most people, this lasts seconds to minutes, and it is a very exhausting session. The longer that a person goes through this phase, the more likely afterwards that they're going to have a long period of needing to rest. The subject, as I said, is very volatile and sensitive to any stimuli, and they're very easy to re-escalate. And this is what gives me reason to talk about one of the most common things I see and hear when people intervene with individuals in crisis. It's amazing how frequently people forget what it's like for them to go through their most aroused state. And so you'll see a situation where a person who's extremely aroused is having somebody else trying to talk them down. And what that individual who's trying to talk the consumer down isn't realizing is that even if they're using their best physical presence and paraverbal communication, there's still going to be stimulation. They still represent stimulus. And they are too much for that individual to manage because their guitar string is plucked so far away from that homeostasis. Their coping mechanisms are so stressed and their mind is so irrational that any amount of stimulus is too much. And what we do is we often go back and re-escalate people accidentally over and over and over again when we should probably just leave them alone. And that's a very difficult thing to get through our heads sometimes because we often feel as though we're not doing anything if we're not intervening in a direct way. And in fact, we are probably going to accomplish much more by controlling the environment around the individual. We'll speak more of that later on. Some people may go so far, especially those who are involved with substances or who have been stressed in a way that is so severe that it actually tests or potentially leads them to go into a psychotic break or an episode of delirium. So some people may become delirious in this point or become and delirium and disorientation are relatively the same. And we've heard about this in circumstances, for example, where people have been in encounters with first responders, especially the police, especially where they've had to be restrained, especially where things like tasers or pepper spray have had to be used. The person seems to be unable to manage that amount of stress, and they literally break from their normal selves. So, what's your stage 3 like? Take a moment and write in the journal what you're like when you're at your absolute peak of behavior. And remember, not all people are dangerous in this stage.